The echo of Bull's thunderous question died against the weathered storefronts, leaving behind a silence so complete that even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Elena's fingers found his massive forearm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so battered. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "help me up. They're watching." Bull's pale blue eyes swept the square. Indeed, they were watching. Mrs. Henderson peering through her curtains at the general store, old Pete Martinez frozen mid-step outside the cantina, even young Tommy Rodriguez halting his bicycle in the middle of the dusty street. But their gazes held something Bull hadn't seen in the 3 years since he'd hung up his sheriff's badge, raw, naked fear. "Easy now," Bull murmured, his voice a gentle rumble as he helped Elena to her feet. At his full height, she barely reached his chest, her dark hair streaked with grey and matted with blood. Her simple cotton dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing purple bruises that made Bull's jaw tighten. "Let's get you to Doc Morrison's." "No." Elena's grip on his arm intensified. "Not there, please. Somewhere private." Bull frowned. Doc Morrison had been treating the folks of Copper Ridge for 20 years, delivering babies and setting broken bones with equal skill. Why would... "They got to him too," Elena said, reading his hesitation. "The mine. They've got their hooks in everyone now." The mine. Copper Ridge Silver and Mineral Company had reopened 6 months ago under new management, bringing promises of jobs and prosperity to a town that had been slowly dying since the war ended. Bull had welcomed it at first, anything to put food on tables and hope in hearts. But lately he'd noticed things, subtle things, the way conversations stopped when he entered Mickey's saloon, how migrant workers who'd been regulars at Santos's market simply vanished without a word. The nervous glances exchanged whenever the mine's black Cadillacs rolled through town. "My place then," Bull decided. His cabin sat on the outskirts of town, far enough from prying eyes but close enough to the main road that folks knew better than to try anything foolish. Not that many would dare cross Bull Mackenzie anyway. Even retired sheriffs cast long shadows in small towns. As they walked, Elena leaning heavily on his arm, Bull noticed how the townspeople melted away like morning mist. Doors closed, window blinds snapped shut. Within minutes, the square that had held a dozen witnesses stood empty except for the 2 of them and the growing pool of blood where Elena had fallen. "How long have you been in Copper Ridge?" Bull asked, partly to keep Elena talking and partly because he realized he'd never seen her before today. In a town of 800 souls, strangers stood out like cacti in a cornfield. 3 weeks. Each word seemed to cost her effort. "Came down from Tucson. I was following a story." "Story? I'm a journalist." "Was. Before." She gestured vaguely toward her unseeing eyes. "Took some shrapnel outside Seoul. But I can still ask questions, still piece things together. Maybe better now. People forget that blind doesn't mean stupid." They'd reached Bull's property, a modest adobe house, with a wide front porch where he'd spent countless evenings watching the sun paint the desert in shades of copper and gold. His workshop sat beside the house, filled with half-finished horseshoes and the tools of his trade. After retiring from law enforcement, Bull had discovered that working with his hands helped quiet the memories of men he'd killed and justice he'd been unable to serve. "What kind of story brings a blind journalist to Copper Ridge?" Bull asked as he settled Elena into his kitchen chair and filled a basin with cool water. "Missing persons. 17 migrant workers in the past 4 months, all of them with families, all of them simply gone." Elena winced as Bull gently cleaned the blood from her temple. No bodies, no goodbyes, no final paychecks collected. Like they walked into the desert and vanished. Bull's hands stilled. He'd heard rumors, whispers in Spanish when he visited Santos's market, but he did assume the workers had simply moved on to other jobs, other opportunities. Arizona's migrant population was transient by nature. "The mine hired them all," Elena continued. "Promised steady work, good wages." But according to the employment records I managed to access, none of them ever officially quit. They're all still on the payroll, money accumulating in accounts that no one touches. How'd you access mine records? A ghost of a smile crossed Elena's battered face. Rex and I made friends with a lot of lonely clerks. Amazing what people will share with a harmless blind woman and her dog. Her smile cracked. Rex was so good, so gentle, he didn't deserve... Bull's massive hands clenched into fists. In 30 years of law enforcement he'd seen plenty of evil, but killing an animal, especially one devoted to helping its disabled owner, represented a special kind of cruelty. "Tell me everything," he said quietly, "and I mean everything, because tomorrow we're going to start asking some very pointed questions." Elena's story unfolded like a roadmap to hell, each detail more damning than the last. She spoke in a measured voice, occasionally pausing to accept the coffee Bull had brewed strong enough to wake the dead. Outside, the desert night settled around his cabin like a familiar blanket, but inside, the warmth felt fragile against the chill of her words. "The families are terrified," Elena said, cradling the mug in both hands. "When I tried to interview them, they'd clam up, cross themselves, and hurry away. But Maria Delgado, her son Carlos, was one of the first to disappear. She finally agreed to meet me behind the old church. Said Carlos had been excited about the mine job, claimed the foreman promised him supervisor wages if he could recruit other good workers." Bull leaned against his kitchen counter, studying the woman who'd stumbled into his quiet retirement like a stone through glass. 3 years of peaceful mornings tending his small garden and shoeing horses for neighboring ranches had almost made him forget the weight of carrying other people's tragedies. Almost. "Maria gave me a list of names," Elena continued. "Men who'd left families in Mexico, others who'd brought wives and children with them. All hired within a 2-week period, all assigned to the deep shafts. When I cross-referenced with the mine's public employment records, 17 names matched perfectly. But when I asked the current shift supervisor about them..." She touched the bandage Bull had fashioned for her temple. "He claimed they'd all quit to follow the cotton harvest north." "Could be true," Bull said, though his gut told him otherwise. "In March? Cotton harvest doesn't start until fall, and these men had families settled here for the season. Carlos Delgado's wife was pregnant. Why would he leave 2 weeks before his child was born?" Elena set down her mug with trembling hands. "So I kept digging, found out the mine's new ownership traces back to a shell company in California, Phoenix Development Corporation. But when I called their listed address, the building had been demolished 6 months ago." Bull moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the dark expanse between his property and town. No headlights, no movement. But that meant nothing. Patient predators knew how to wait. "Who else knows you've been investigating?" "Too many people now. The clerk at the county records office, the postmaster who helped me send letters to families in Mexico, Santos at the market. He translated for me when my Spanish failed." Elena's voice dropped. "They killed Rex to send me a message, beat me to emphasize it. Next time..." "There won't be a next time." The words came out harder than Bull intended, carrying echoes of the man he'd been when a badge gave weight to his promises. But even as he spoke, Bull felt the familiar tug-of-war between duty and self-preservation. For 3 years, he'd cultivated this quiet life deliberately. No more midnight calls about domestic violence that would escalate until someone died. No more politicians pressuring him to look the other way when their friends bent the law. No more young deputies looking to him for wisdom he wasn't sure he possessed. He'd earned this peace with 30 years of service and too many sleepless nights. His retirement routine had become sacred. Coffee before dawn, tending his small vegetable garden as the sun crested the mountains, working in his smithy until the heat drove him indoors for lunch and a brief siesta. Evenings brought visits from neighbors needing horsework, their easy conversation about weather and cattle prices a balm after decades of dealing with humanity's darker impulses. Saturday nights he'd join the old-timers at Mickey's saloon for poker and stories that grew taller with each telling. Sundays he'd drive into Tucson for supplies and a proper meal, sometimes catching a picture show if something decent was playing. It wasn't a grand life, but it was his. No one depended on him beyond the handful of ranchers who brought their horses for shoeing. No one looked to him for justice or protection or answers to questions that kept honest folks awake at night. The closest thing he had to family was Sarah Chen, who ran the Chinese restaurant in Tucson and always saved him the corner booth where he could sit with his back to the wall. Old habits died hard. But as Elena sat in his kitchen, her sightless eyes somehow managing to pin him with their intensity, Bull felt those 3 years of carefully constructed peace beginning to crack. Because beneath her story of missing workers and corporate shells lay something he recognized from his years of law enforcement, the particular stench of evil that flourished when good people chose to look away. "I should take you to Tucson," he said finally. "State police there, FBI field office, people with authority to..." "To what? Investigate a story about missing migrant workers that a blind woman can't prove?" Elena shook her head. "By the time they take it seriously, if they ever do, any evidence will be buried deeper than those workers probably are." Bull's hands tightened on the window frame. She was right, and they both knew it. The sound came at 3 in the morning, a soft scratching at Bull's front door like branches against wood, except no trees grew that close to his porch. Bull's eyes snapped open in the darkness, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt. .45 he kept in the nightstand drawer. 30 years of law enforcement had taught him to trust the primitive part of his brain that could distinguish between wind and threat. Elena stirred on the couch where she'd insisted on sleeping despite his offer of the spare bedroom. "What is it?" she whispered. "Stay put." Bull slipped from bed, bare feet silent on the worn wooden floor. The scratching came again, more urgent now, followed by a sound that made his blood freeze. A woman's voice, barely audible, speaking rapid Spanish. Bull reached the window beside the front door and peered through a gap in the curtains. A small figure huddled against his porch rail, little more than a shadow wrapped in a dark rebozo. As his eyes adjusted, he could make out long black hair and the pale oval of a young face, streaked with tears. He opened the door slowly, gun held low but ready. "Señora?" The woman looked up at him, 18, maybe 19 years old, her eyes wide with terror. "Por favor, señor." "You helped the Señora Ciega, yes? The blind lady?" Her English was broken but understandable. "I am Carmen Delgado. Carlos es mi esposo." Elena appeared at Bull's shoulder, moving with the careful confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate without sight. "Carmen? Maria's daughter-in-law?" "Si." The girl's voice cracked with relief. "Maria said you asked questions about Carlos. I come to tell you, but they watch Maria's house now. Black cars. So I wait, walk in the desert, come here when they sleep." Bull scanned the darkness beyond his porch. If the girl had been followed, but the night held only cricket song and the distant howl of a coyote. "Come inside. Quickly." Carmen stumbled through the door, and in the lamplight Bull could see she was pregnant, her belly round beneath the threadbare dress. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands shook as Elena guided her to a chair. "How far along?" Elena asked gently. 7 months. The baby. Carmen's hand moved protectively to her stomach. Carlos was so excited. He said the mine job would give us enough money for the hospital in Tucson, for proper doctors. He said El Jefe promised him supervisor wages if he brought good workers. Bull poured water from the pitcher, his mind racing. The girl had risked everything to come here, which meant she had something worth the risk to tell them. "What happened to Carlos, Carmen?" Elena's voice was patient, professional, the real story. Carmen's composure cracked. "He came home one night, maybe 3 weeks ago, very scared. Said he saw things in the deep mine, things that weren't natural, not mining things." She struggled for words. "Bodies," he said, "old bodies, and fresh ones too." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of Bull's wall clock. Outside, that coyote howled again, closer now. Carlos wanted to quit, Carmen continued, but when he tried, the foreman, big man with scars here. She touched her cheek. He said Carlos knew too much now. Said he could keep working or he could disappear like the others who asked too many questions. Bull's hands slowly clenched into fists. What did Carlos do? He was going to run. Take me to my cousin in California, but first he wanted proof of what he saw. He brought me this. Carmen reached into her rebozo and withdrew something that gleamed dully in the lamplight, a wedding ring, small and simple, with an inscription worn smooth by years of wear. Elena took the ring, running her fingers over its surface. There's writing inside. Bull, property of Eduardo Vasquez, Bull read aloud. Elena, that name mean anything to... My God. Elena's face went white. Eduardo Vasquez disappeared 2 months ago. His wife came to see me in Tucson, begged me to help find him. He was saving money to bring his family north from Sonora. Carmen nodded miserably. Carlos said there were many rings, watches, wedding pictures, like a collection. Bull felt something cold settle in his gut. This wasn't just about missing workers or corporate fraud. This was about predators who took trophies from their kills. Where's Carlos now? He asked, though he feared he already knew. Carmen's tears came freely now. 3 days ago he didn't come home. The foreman came to our room, said Carlos quit without notice, said he took the bus to Los Angeles. But Carlos, he was afraid of buses. Car accident when he was little. He would never... She looked between Bull and Elena with desperate hope. You will help, yes? Find what happened to me, Carlos? Bull stared at the ring in Elena's palm, feeling the weight of 30 years' worth of choices pressing down on him. He could drive Carmen to Tucson tonight, turn her over to state authorities, wash his hands of the whole mess, return to his quiet retirement, his peaceful mornings, his carefully constructed solitude. Or he could do what every instinct screamed at him to do, what the man he'd been for 3 decades demanded he do. The choice, he realized, had already been made the moment Elena stumbled into that square, calling for help. But even as that certainty settled into his bones, Bull found himself stepping back from the table, from Carmen's tear-streaked face and Elena's expectant silence. The wedding ring seemed to burn in Elena's palm like an accusation. I need some air, he said gruffly, pushing through the kitchen door onto his back porch. The desert night wrapped around him, vast and indifferent, under a canopy of stars that had witnessed countless human tragedies without blinking. Bull gripped the porch railing, his massive hands making the weathered wood creak in protest. Behind him, he could hear Elena's gentle voice comforting Carmen, but the words blurred into white noise against the roar of his own doubts. 30 years, 3 decades of carrying other people's pain, of standing between the wolves and the sheep, of making split-second decisions that left men dead and families destroyed. He'd earned his peace, paid for it with sleepless nights and a liver that protested every time he looked at a bottle, paid for it with the loneliness that came from seeing too much of humanity's capacity for cruelty. The mine's operation was bigger than anything he'd tackled as sheriff of a county that barely had enough budget for 2 patrol cars and a part-time deputy. This wasn't drunken cowboys shooting up the saloon or cattle rustlers working the backcountry. This was organized, protected, connected to money and power that reached far beyond Copper Ridge. The kind of enemy that crushed small-town lawmen like bugs under a boot heel. Bull thought of Tommy Reeves, the eager young deputy who'd worked under him during his last years as sheriff. Tommy had wanted to investigate rumors about a gambling operation run out of the old Morrison ranch. Bull had told him to let sleeping dogs lie, that some fights weren't worth picking. 2 weeks later, they'd found Tommy's patrol car wrapped around a cottonwood tree on a perfectly straight stretch of road. Brake failure, the report had said. Mechanical malfunction. Bull had known better. Had also known that pursuing it would only get more good men killed. The smart play here was obvious. Drive Carmen to Tucson, turn her over to the FBI, let Elena tell her story to federal agents with resources and jurisdiction, wash his hands of the whole mess, and returned to his forge, his garden, his carefully maintained isolation from the world's casual cruelties. Through the kitchen window, he watched Elena help Carmen drink a glass of water, the blind woman's movements sure and gentle despite her own injuries. There was something almost maternal in the way she guided the pregnant girl's hands, how she listened with complete attention to Carmen's whispered fears about raising her child alone. Bull's chest tightened. Elena reminded him of his mother, not in appearance, but in that quality of fierce compassion that made her reach out to strangers' pain even when her own world was crumbling. His mother had been like that, taking in stray cats and homeless drifters, insisting there was always room at their table for one more soul in need. It had gotten her killed. A drifter with kind eyes and calloused hands had cut her throat for the $15 she kept in the coffee tin on the mantel. 10-year-old Samuel had found her when he came home from school, his lunch pail clattering to the floor as he saw what was left of the woman who'd sung him to sleep every night of his life. That was the world's truth. Kindness was weakness, and weakness got you killed. The strong preyed on the gentle, and good intentions paved the road to bloody floors and empty coffee tins. But Elena wasn't his mother. Elena had walked into hell for 17 strangers, had taken a beating and kept asking questions even when smart people would have run. She'd lost her sight in a war zone and somehow found the courage to keep fighting battles she couldn't see. And Carmen, Christ, Carmen was barely older than his mother had been when she'd taken in that last drifter. Pregnant, scared, trusting 2 strangers because she had nowhere else to turn. If Bull walked away now, what happened to her? What happened to her unborn child when the men who'd collected Eduardo Vasquez's wedding ring decided she knew too much? Bull's hands were shaking. When had that started? He stared at them in the starlight, these massive hands that could gentle a spooked horse or break a man's neck with equal ease, and realized they were trembling like an old man's. Maybe that's what he was now. Too old for this fight, too tired to stand against the kind of evil that turned human beings into trophies. Maybe the smart thing was to step aside and let younger, stronger men take up the burden. But when he looked through that kitchen window again and saw Elena's bandaged temple, saw Carmen's protective hand curved over her belly, Bull felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was safely buried. Not duty. Duty was cold, professional, sustainable. This was rage, white-hot and personal. They'd killed Elena's dog. They'd beaten a blind woman for asking questions. They'd murdered 17 men and kept their wedding rings like scalps. Some sins, Bull realized, were too big to walk away from. Bull squared his shoulders and walked back into the kitchen, the screen door settling behind him with a soft bang that seemed to echo with finality. Carmen looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, and Elena turned her head toward his footsteps, her face expectant in the lamplight. "Carmen," Bull said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect from hardened criminals and scared deputies alike. "I need you to tell me everything you remember about that mine. Every detail Carlos shared, every name he mentioned, every face you've seen coming and going from your boarding house. No matter how small it seems." Elena's shoulders relaxed slightly, and Bull realized she'd been holding her breath waiting for his decision. Carmen clutched the water glass with both hands, knuckles white against the ceramic. "Si, senor. Carlos. He said the new foreman came 3 months ago. Man named Hutchins, tall, with scars like knife cuts on his face. Carlos thought maybe he was in the war, but not like other soldiers. Different kind of fighting." Carmen's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if sharing the burden made it lighter. "Hutchins brought his own men too. 5, maybe 6. They don't live in town. They have a trailer behind the mine office." Bull pulled out the notebook he'd used for case notes back when cases were his business. The leather cover was worn smooth, pages yellowed at the edges, but his hand remembered its weight like an old friend. "This Hutchins, he run the whole operation?" "No, senor. There is another man. Carlos only saw him twice, but Hutchins, he was very different when this man came. Afraid, you know. Carlos said he wore expensive clothes, drove a black Cadillac with California plates. Elena leaned forward. Did Carlos see the license plate? Carmen shook her head, but he said the man had soft hands, like someone who never worked with tools. Bull scribbled notes, his mind already working the angles. Outside money, professional muscle, local operations. It had the structure of organized crime, but the trophy-taking suggested something more personal, more twisted. What about the local law? Bull asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Sheriff Davies ever come around asking questions? Carmen's expression darkened. Sheriff Davies came to our boarding house last week, said there were complaints about noise, about too many Mexican families in one place. But Carlos said he saw Davies talking to Hutchins by the mine gate 2 days before Eduardo disappeared. Bull's pen stopped moving. Tom Davies had been his deputy 15 years ago, a decent enough lawman, if not particularly bright. Bull had recommended him for sheriff when his own retirement became official. The thought of Davies taking money to look the other way sat in Bull's stomach like spoiled meat. Carmen, I'm going to ask something difficult of you, Bull said gently. Carlos brought you that ring as proof. Did he say if there were other things? Documents, photographs, anything else hidden? The girl's hand moved instinctively to her belly, and Bull saw the gesture for what it was. Protection, but also concealment. Carmen? Elena's voice was patient but firm. If Carlos left something, we need to know. Carmen reached beneath her rebozo and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it, revealing several items that made Bull's blood run cold: 3 more wedding rings, a woman's gold locket, and a creased photograph showing a group of men standing beside mining equipment. He was so scared when he brought these, Carmen whispered. Said he found them in Hutchins's desk when he was cleaning the office. Said he had to take them because maybe families would want them back someday. Bull studied the photograph through the magnifying glass he kept for reading fine print. 6 men in work clothes stood around a cart loaded with what looked like ore samples. But something was wrong with the picture. The shadows fell at impossible angles, and the expressions on the faces were too stiff, too staged. Elena, he said slowly, I think this photograph was taken underground, in the mine itself. Elena took the picture, running her fingers along its edges with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to see with touch. The paper's recent. This was developed within the last month. Bull felt the pieces clicking together like chambers in a revolver. The missing workers, the trophy collection, the staged photograph. Someone was documenting their kills, either for blackmail leverage or simple, sick pleasure. He looked across the table at Carmen's frightened face, at Elena's determined profile, and felt the last of his retirement certainties crumble away. There was no safe distance from this kind of evil, no neutral ground where good people could wait for someone else to act. We're going to find Carlos, Bull said, and the words came out like an oath sworn on sacred ground. And we're going to stop whatever's happening in that mine. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. Carmen shook her head frantically. No, senor, if I run, they know Carlos told me things. They hunt me forever. Bull met Elena's sightless gaze and saw his own grim understanding reflected there. The girl was right. Running would only confirm her as a threat. Their only safety lay in exposing the truth completely, in dragging whatever lurked in those mine shafts into the harsh light of justice. The threshold was crossed. There was no going back now. Bull stared at the photograph, his mind racing through possibilities and calculating odds the way he'd done countless times before walking into situations where good men could die. The difference was, back then he'd had a badge, backup, and the law's authority behind him. Now he had a blind woman, a pregnant girl, and 30 years of instincts telling him this was bigger than anything Copper Ridge had ever seen. We need allies, he said finally, setting the photograph aside. People we can trust who won't fold the minute Hutchins or his boss applies pressure. Elena nodded slowly. What about Dr. Morrison? He treated my injuries without asking questions, and he's been in this town long enough to know who's honest. Doc's a good man, but he's 73 years old and has a heart condition. Bull rubbed his jaw, feeling the stubble rasp against his palm. We need someone with authority, someone clean. Carmen looked between them uncertainly. In town, there is a man, Pete Kowalski. He works at the telegraph office. Carlos liked him, said he never cheated the Mexican workers on money transfers, always honest about fees. Bull knew Pete, a Polish immigrant who'd settled in Copper Ridge after the First War. Steady, quiet, the kind of man who kept his head down and his mouth shut. But that didn't necessarily mean he could be trusted with something this dangerous. We need to test him, Elena said, as if reading Bull's thoughts. See how he reacts to pressure. Before Bull could respond, a sound from outside made him freeze. The soft crunch of boots on gravel, moving too carefully to be casual. He held up a hand for silence, then moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. 3 men stood near his truck, their faces hidden in shadow. One carried what looked like a crowbar, another a coil of rope. The third kept glancing toward the house while the other 2 worked on something near the truck's front wheel. Bull's blood went cold. They weren't being subtle about this, which meant they didn't intend to leave witnesses. He moved quickly, quietly, gathering the rings and photograph from the table. Carmen, take these and hide in the root cellar. Elena, you know where it is from earlier? At Elena's nod, he continued. Lock yourselves in and don't come out until you hear my voice calling all clear 3 times. Anyone else comes down there, there's a shotgun on the bottom shelf. Bull, what? Elena started. Company, he said grimly, checking the loads in his service revolver. The kind that doesn't knock. Through the window, he saw one of the men signal toward the house. They were done with whatever sabotage they'd performed on his truck and moving toward the front door. Carmen whimpered, her hand pressed to her mouth. Elena found the girl's arm and guided her toward the cellar door, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate crisis situations without sight. Bull waited until he heard the cellar door close, then positioned himself behind the kitchen table, using its heavy oak surface as partial cover. His hands were steady now, amazing how quickly the old training kicked in when lives were on the line. The front door rattled under someone's fist. Mackenzie, open up! Sheriff's Department! Bull almost laughed. Davies wouldn't send men to his house at midnight, and certainly not men who sabotaged vehicles before announcing themselves. But the charade told him something important. They still cared about appearances, which meant the corruption hadn't spread to everyone in town. It's late for social calls, boys, Bull called back. Come around during daylight hours and we'll talk. This is official business, Mackenzie. Open the door, or we'll open it for you. Bull heard wood splintering as they applied the crowbar to his front door frame. Amateurs. They were making enough noise to wake half the county. Professional killers would have come through the windows silent as smoke. The door burst open and 3 men rushed in, but they hesitated in the front room, letting their eyes adjust to the darkness. That hesitation cost them the initiative. Evening, gentlemen, Bull said from the kitchen doorway, his revolver trained on the nearest intruder. Awful late to be conducting sheriff's business. The man with the crowbar, young, nervous, with the soft look of someone who'd never been in a real fight, took a step back. Now hold on, Mackenzie. We just want to talk. Funny way of starting a conversation. Bull's voice carried the flat authority that had once made hardened criminals reconsider their life choices. Drop the hardware and put your hands where I can see them. Instead, the third man, older, with scars on his face that Carmen would recognize, smiled coldly. You're outnumbered, old man, and outgunned. He gestured slightly, and Bull realized the nervous kid was carrying more than a crowbar. There was a pistol tucked into his belt. Maybe, Bull acknowledged. But the question is, how many of you are willing to die to find out? The scarred man's smile widened, and Bull knew with cold certainty that this one had killed before and would do so again without hesitation. The test had found them first. The moment stretched like a wire pulled tight, each man calculating distances and odds in the yellow lamplight. Bull's finger rested easy on his revolver's trigger, not tense, not eager, just ready. 30 years of facing down dangerous men had taught him that the first person to flinch usually ended up bleeding. The scarred man, Hutchins, Bull realized, matching Carmen's description, shifted his weight forward. Professional. The nervous kid with the crowbar was sweating despite the cool night air. The third man, stocky and silent, kept his hand near a knife sheathed at his hip. "You know why we're here, Mackenzie." Hutchins's voice carried the flat certainty of a man accustomed to getting his way through violence. "That blind woman and the Mexican girl, they're wanted for questioning." "Funny thing about questioning," Bull said conversationally. "Usually works better when the subjects aren't beaten half to death first." Hutchins's smile never wavered. "Accidents happen when people resist lawful authority. You boys wearing badges I can't see? We don't need badges for what comes next." The kid with the crowbar was starting to shake. Bull marked him as the weak link, young enough to still have illusions about right and wrong, nervous enough to break if pressed. The knife man was the real danger, though. He hadn't said a word, hadn't moved, but his eyes never left Bull's gun hand. Patience like that came from experience. "Tell you what," Bull said, keeping his revolver trained on Hutchins while tracking the others in his peripheral vision. "I'll make you boys a counteroffer. Walk away now, and I won't mention to Sheriff Davies that you've been impersonating law enforcement." Hutchins laughed, the sound harsh in the cramped space. "Davies knows exactly where we are, old man. Who do you think sent us?" The words hit Bull like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. Tom Davies, the earnest young deputy who'd once asked Bull's advice about proposing to his sweetheart, who'd sworn his oath of office with tears in his eyes, had sold out completely. "Even if that's true," Bull said slowly, "breaking into a citizen's home without a warrant is still a felony. Federal crime if you cross state lines to get here. No one's going to file charges." Hutchins took a half-step forward, testing Bull's resolve. "See, we already know what happened to that Mexican boy Carlos. Tragic mining accident. Cave in. These things happen when workers don't follow safety protocols." Bull's jaw tightened. They were confirming Carlos's death like it was a casual business expense. "And the 17 others?" "What 17 others?" Hutchins's smile widened. "You're talking crazy, old man. Must be the stress of retirement affecting your mind." The knife man moved then. Not attacking, just shifting position to get a better angle on Bull's blind spot. Bull swiveled slightly, keeping all 3 men in sight, but the movement put his back closer to the kitchen wall. They were herding him, limiting his options. "Here's what's going to happen," Hutchins continued. "You're going to tell us where you hid the women. We're going to take them for questioning. And you're going to forget this conversation ever happened. And if I refuse—" Hutchins gestured toward the front door. "Your truck's got brake problems now. Terrible accident waiting to happen on these mountain roads. Could take days for someone to find the wreckage." Bull felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the recognition that these men had moved beyond threats into inevitability. They'd already decided how this would end. The only question was how many people would die before they got there. Through the floorboards, he heard the faintest creak from the root cellar. Elena and Carmen probably straining to hear what was happening above. If this went badly, would they have sense enough to stay hidden? Or would Elena's protective instincts drive her to help, blind and injured as she was? The thought of these animals getting their hands on either woman made Bull's vision narrow to a red tunnel. He'd seen what they'd done to Elena's face, heard the casual way Hutchins discussed Carlos's murder. There would be no mercy for witnesses, no clean deaths for inconvenient questions. "Last chance, Mackenzie." Hutchins's hand drifted toward his jacket. "Where are they?" Bull's finger tightened on the trigger. In the lamplight, he could see the kid with the crowbar backing toward the door, smart boy, getting clear of the crossfire. The knife man had gone perfectly still, coiled like a rattler ready to strike. 30 years of keeping the peace, and it came down to this. 3 killers in his kitchen, 2 innocent women hiding in his cellar, and the law itself corrupted beyond recognition. Bull had always known this moment might come. The moment when all the compromises and careful politicking fell away, leaving only the choice between standing or falling. He chose to stand. The gunshot shattered the night's silence like breaking glass. Bull's revolver bucked in his hand as Hutchins's jacket cleared leather, the scarred man's pistol only halfway drawn when the .45 slug took him center mass. The impact slammed Hutchins backward into the wall, his weapon clattering across the floorboards as he slumped down, dark wetness spreading across his shirt front. The knife man moved like lightning, his blade whisper quiet as it left its sheath, but Bull was already pivoting, 30 years of muscle memory driving him sideways as steel cut air where his throat had been. The knife man's momentum carried him forward, and Bull brought his revolver's barrel down hard against the side of the man's skull. The crack of metal on bone was sickeningly final. The kid with the crowbar stood frozen in the doorway, his weapon trembling in white-knuckled hands. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, staring at the spreading pool beneath Hutchins. "Jesus Christ, you killed him." "Drop it, son." Bull kept his gun trained on the boy while checking his peripheral vision for movement from the knife man. "You're young enough to walk away from this. Don't make me put you down too." The crowbar hit the floor with a metallic ring. The kid's face was chalk white, his breathing rapid and shallow. "We wasn't supposed to kill nobody. Hutchins said you'd listen to reason." Bull felt something bitter rise in his throat. They'd come to his home, threatened innocent women, and this boy thought there should be rules about consequences. "What's your name?" "Billy. Billy Rourke." The words came out in a rush. "My dad works the loading dock at the mine. We need the money, mister. My mom's been sick and the medical bills." "How many others, Billy?" Bull's voice cut through the boy's babbling. "How many men does the operation have?" Billy's eyes darted toward Hutchins's still form. "I don't know everything. Maybe 8, 10 guys total. But most of them ain't local. They got a camp up past the old Prescott claim." The floorboards creaked overhead, someone else moving through the house. Bull's blood went cold as he realized they'd been set up. The 3 men weren't the whole team. They were the distraction. "How many came with you tonight?" Bull demanded. But Billy was already looking past him toward the kitchen, his expression shifting from fear to something like relief. "Enough," said a new voice from behind Bull. Bull spun, but the man emerging from his bedroom hallway had a shotgun leveled and ready. Older than the others, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent serious time in wild country. His clothes were expensive but practical, the kind a man wore when he expected to get dirty, but wanted to look respectable doing it. "Mr. Mackenzie." The man's voice carried a slight accent Bull couldn't place, not foreign, but educated in a way that suggested money and privilege. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. My associates have a tendency toward crudeness." Bull kept his revolver aimed at the newcomer's center mass, calculating angles. The shotgun had him outgunned at this range, but the man would have to expose himself to get a clear shot at the cellar door. "You must be the fellow with the soft hands and the California plates." The man smiled, and Bull saw immediately why Hutchins had been afraid of him. There was something reptilian in those eyes, an absence of normal human warmth that made even hardened killers nervous. "My reputation precedes me." How gratifying. "What's your interest in a dried-up mining town?" "Business opportunities. Arizona is full of natural resources, and I've found that local labor can be quite cost-effective when properly managed." Bull understood then. The missing workers weren't just dead, they'd been worked to death, slave labor in the mines, with the victims' disappearances covered up by a web of corruption that reached from the sheriff's office to God knew where else. The blind woman and her companion, the man continued conversationally. "I understand they're guests in your home. I'd very much like to speak with them. They're not here." The man tilted his head slightly, like a bird studying prey. "Mr. Mackenzie, I admire your protective instincts, truly, but you're a reasonable man who understands how the world works. These people, the migrants, the transients, they're invisible. No one reports them missing because no one expects them to stay in one place. Except they weren't invisible to Elena Vasquez. No, Unfortunately not. But that problem can still be managed quietly, with minimal disruption to the community. Bull felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Below his feet, two women waited for him to find a way out of this. Behind him, Billy Rourke sniffled quietly, probably wondering if he'd live to see morning. And somewhere up in the darkness beyond his property line, more killers waited for the signal that the job was done. Everything he'd learned about honor, about duty, about the difference between law and justice was being tested in this cramped kitchen with gun smoke still hanging in the air. The choice was no longer between standing and falling. It was between saving innocents and saving himself. And Bull Mackenzie had never been much good at the mathematics of self-preservation. "I've got a better idea," Bull said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once ended barroom fights with a single word. "You boys pack up your operation and find someplace else to—" The shotgun blast came from behind the man with the California accent, not from his weapon. Bull dove sideways as buckshot chewed splinters from the kitchen wall where his head had been. A fourth man stepped through the back door, the one Bull hadn't secured because he'd been too focused on the front entrance. Amateur mistake, fatal mistake. The man with the reptilian eyes smiled as Bull hit the floor hard, his revolver skittering across the linoleum toward the stove. "Mr. Mackenzie, I really had hoped we could reach an accommodation." Bull's shoulder screamed where he'd landed wrong, but he forced himself to roll toward the kitchen table as the shotgunner pumped another shell into the chamber. The heavy oak took the second blast, wood fragments raining down on Bull's back as he pressed himself against the floor. "Billy, check the cellar," the leader ordered calmly. "Mr. Patterson, watch the front. I suspect our host is about to become very cooperative." Bull's blood turned to ice water as he heard Billy Rourke's reluctant footsteps moving toward the cellar door. The boy might be young and scared, but he'd follow orders to keep himself breathing. In 30 seconds, Elena and Carmen would be dragged up into the lamplight to face whatever these animals had planned. He lunged for his revolver, fingers closing around the grip just as Patterson, the shotgunner, came around the table with his weapon raised. Bull rolled and fired from the floor, the .45 slug taking Patterson in the thigh and spinning him sideways. The man's return shot went wide, blasting a hole in the kitchen window. But the leader had moved during the exchange, and Bull found himself staring down the barrel of Hutchins's dropped pistol. "Enough," the man said quietly. "Mr. Rourke, bring up our guests." The cellar door creaked open. Bull heard Elena's voice, tight with controlled fear. "It's all right, Carmen. Stay calm." They emerged into the kitchen like ghosts materializing from Bull's worst nightmares. Carmen's face was streaked with tears, her dark eyes wide with terror as Billy prodded her forward with a crowbar. Elena moved with careful dignity despite her injuries, her hand finding and steadying the girl's shoulder. "Ah, Miss Vasquez." The leader's voice carried genuine pleasure. "You've caused us considerable inconvenience." Elena's chin lifted defiantly. "Not half as much as I intend to cause." The man laughed, a sound like glass breaking in a church. "Admirable spirit. It's almost a shame to waste such determination." His eyes shifted to Bull, who was still flat on the floor with Patterson's shotgun trained on his skull. "Mr. Mackenzie, I believe you can see how this ends. The question is whether these ladies suffer unnecessarily during the process." Bull felt the world narrowing to a single point of crystalline clarity. Every choice he'd made since Elena stumbled into the town square had led to this moment. Two innocent women about to die because he'd been too stubborn to walk away, too proud to admit he was outmatched. Patterson's leg was bleeding badly, but the man's hands were steady on the shotgun. Billy looked ready to vomit, but he kept the crowbar pressed against Carmen's spine. The leader held Hutchins's pistol with the casual competence of someone who'd killed before and expected to kill again. 3 armed men, 2 hostages, and Bull flat on his back with an empty gun and a dislocated shoulder. "You want to know the beautiful thing about this country?" the leader continued conversationally. "People disappear here all the time. Mining accidents, flash floods, wild animals. Poor Mr. Mackenzie, living alone so far from town. Who knows how long it might take for someone to find what's left?" Bull's mind raced through possibilities, each one ending in blood and failure. He could try for Patterson's legs, maybe get the shotgun turned away from the women for a few seconds, but Billy would panic and bring the crowbar down on Carmen's skull before Bull could reach him. He could throw himself at the leader, try to absorb the pistol shot and hope Elena was smart enough to run. But Elena couldn't run. She was blind, injured, and responsible for Carmen. She'd fight instead of fleeing, and they'd both die for his gesture. There was no winning move, no clever strategy, no last-minute salvation. For the first time in his adult life, Bull Mackenzie was completely, utterly beaten. "I see understanding in your eyes," the leader observed. "Good. Now then, Miss Vasquez, shall we discuss what you've learned about our operation? I'm particularly interested in what you might have shared with others before tonight." Elena's voice was steady as granite. "Go to hell." The man's smile widened, and Bull knew they were all about to die. The leader's finger began to tighten on the trigger, and in that crystalline moment before death, Bull heard something that changed everything, the soft metallic click of a rifle bolt being worked outside his kitchen window. "I wouldn't," came a familiar voice from the darkness beyond the broken glass. "Unless you boys want to see how fast I can cycle this Winchester." Bull's heart lurched with recognition. Tom Davies, not the corrupted Sheriff Bull had feared, but the young deputy speaking with the quiet authority of a man who'd finally chosen his side. The leader's reptilian smile faltered. "Sheriff Davies. How unexpected." "Deputy Davies," Tom corrected, his rifle barrel visible through the shattered window. "The sheriff won't be joining us tonight. Seems he had an accident with his cell door, locked himself inside after I found 18 sets of identification papers in his desk. Amazing how careless a man gets when he's been taking blood money." Bull felt something shift inside his chest. Not relief exactly, but the return of possibility. Patterson's shotgun wavered slightly as the wounded man tried to track multiple threats. Billy's crowbar trembled against Carmen's spine. "You're making a mistake, Deputy," the leader said calmly. "This is a federal operation. You're interfering with—" "Shut up!" Tom's voice cut through the lie like a blade. "I've been tracking you bastards for 3 weeks. Ever since I found Carlos Morales' body in that mine shaft, you thought nobody would check." Bull watched the leader's face, seeing the moment when calculation replaced confidence. Tom wasn't alone. Bull could hear at least 2 other sets of footsteps moving around his house, positioning themselves at different angles. "Billy Rourke," Tom called out. "Your mama's worried sick about you, son. Drop that crowbar and step away from the girl." The kid's resolve cracked like an eggshell. The crowbar clattered to the floor as Billy stumbled backward, his hands raised and shaking. "I didn't want to hurt nobody, Deputy Davies. They said it was just intimidation." Carmen darted away from Billy, moving toward Elena with the quick grace of a frightened deer. But the leader tracked her movement with his pistol, and Bull saw murder crystallizing in those cold eyes. Time slowed to amber honey. Bull rolled hard to his left, his injured shoulder screaming as he threw himself between the gun and the 2 women. The pistol cracked, and he felt the bullet tear through the meat of his upper arm, spinning him sideways into the kitchen cabinet. Patterson swung his shotgun toward the window, where Tom's rifle barrel protruded. But Elena moved with the deadly precision of someone who'd navigated war zones by sound alone. She swept a cast-iron skillet from the stovetop and brought it down on Patterson's wounded thigh with surgical accuracy. The man's scream shattered the night as he collapsed, his shotgun discharging harmlessly into the ceiling. Tom's Winchester spoke once through the window. The leader jerked backward, his pistol flying from nerveless fingers as the rifle bullet shattered his wrist. He stumbled against the wall, his face gone white with shock and pain. "Federal agents!" The shout came from Bull's front door as it exploded inward. 3 men in FBI windbreakers poured into the kitchen, weapons drawn and ready, hands visible. Now, Bull slumped against the cabinet, blood running down his arm, watching as the nightmare finally ended. The leader, whoever he really was, pressed himself against the wall like a cornered rat, his shattered wrist cradled against his chest. Patterson lay moaning on the floor, his leg bleeding freely. Billy Rourke stood frozen with his hands up, tears streaming down his young face. Elena had found Carmen and pulled the girl into a protective embrace, both of them shaking but alive. Through the ringing in his ears, Bull could hear more vehicles arriving outside. Real law enforcement this time, not the corrupted local version. Tom Davies climbed through the broken window, his rifle still ready but no longer needed. His young face was grim with newfound understanding about the world's capacity for evil. "You all right, Bull?" Tom's voice carried 30 years of respect, compressed into 3 words. Bull managed a nod, though his arm felt like it was on fire. "How long have you been watching?" "Since yesterday. FBI got a tip about the operation from someone in California. Apparently our friend here has been running similar schemes in 3 other states." Tom glanced toward the leader, who was being handcuffed by one of the federal agents. "We needed evidence, and we needed the whole network. Thanks to Miss Vasquez's investigation and your willingness to stick your neck out, we got both." Bull looked at Elena, seeing her properly for the first time since this started. Not just a victim anymore, but a warrior who'd chosen to fight impossible odds because someone had to. She'd lost her sight, but not her vision of what justice looked like. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. He'd spent 30 years believing that law and justice were the same thing, when they were often enemies. Real justice required exactly what Elena had shown, the willingness to stand alone against the darkness, even when standing meant falling. Especially when it meant falling. The FBI medic finished wrapping Bull's arm with practiced efficiency, though his hands moved with the particular gentleness reserved for wounded giants. "You'll want to see a proper doctor tomorrow," he said, packing his supplies. "That bullet nicked the bone." Bull nodded, testing the movement in his shoulder. Pain flared, but nothing felt fundamentally broken. He'd survived worse, though not often in his own kitchen. Around him, the chaos of federal investigation continued. Agents photographed everything, collected evidence, and processed the prisoners with methodical precision. Billy Rourke sat at Bull's kitchen table, no longer a threat but not yet free, his statement being taken by a patient agent who looked young enough to be the boy's brother. Elena had refused medical attention beyond basic first aid, insisting that Carmen be examined first. The girl showed no physical injuries beyond exhaustion and terror, but she clung to Elena's hand like a lifeline. Both of them occupied the living room now, wrapped in blankets and speaking quietly with a victim advocate who'd arrived with the second wave of vehicles. Tall. Tom Davies approached with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he pressed into Bull's uninjured hand. "Thought you might need this." The coffee was bitter and strong, exactly what the moment required. Bull studied Tom over the rim of his cup, seeing changes in the young man's face that hadn't been there a week ago. The easy confidence of small-town authority had been replaced by something harder and more knowing. "When did you figure it out?" Bull asked. "About the sheriff." Tom's jaw tightened. 3 weeks ago, when I found Carlos Morales. The official report said mining accident, but Carlos had been beaten before he died. When I tried to pursue it, Sheriff Hutchins transferred me to traffic duty and told me to focus on more pressing matters. He took a long sip of coffee. "That's when I reached out to some contacts I'd made during my training. FBI had been tracking similar operations across the Southwest. Takes courage to go against your own department. Takes courage to go against killers in your kitchen." Tom gestured toward the bloodstains on the linoleum. "Though I hear that's becoming a habit for you." Bull almost smiled at that. In the past week, he'd discovered reserves of stubbornness he'd forgotten he possessed, or perhaps developed entirely new ones. The comfortable retirement he'd planned seemed like something from another man's life now. Agent Morrison, the FBI team leader, finished his conversation with the prisoner transport team and walked over. He was a compact man with prematurely gray hair and the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he'd seen too much and remembered all of it. "Mr. Mackenzie," Morrison said, offering his hand, "we owe you considerable thanks. Without Miss Vasquez's investigation and your willingness to harbor her, this operation might have continued indefinitely. How big was it?" Morrison's expression darkened. bigger than we initially thought. At least 40 missing persons across 4 states, probably more. They'd target migrants and transients, people whose disappearances wouldn't generate immediate attention. Then they'd transport them to remote mining operations and work them until they died. The simple brutality of it hit Bull like a physical blow. 40 people, 40 families somewhere, wondering what had happened to sons, fathers, brothers who'd simply vanished into the American landscape. The man who ran this cell, his real name is Lawrence Kellerman. He's wanted for similar operations in Nevada, California, and New Mexico. Tonight was the first time we've gotten him alive. Bull glanced toward the living room where Elena sat with Carmen. What about Elena's investigation? The evidence she gathered? Essential. Her documentation provided connections we couldn't have made otherwise. She's got a journalist's eye for detail and a war correspondent's understanding of how evil hides in plain sight. Through the kitchen window, Bull could see dawn beginning to touch the eastern mountains. The long night was finally ending, but something told him the real work was just beginning. There'll be trials, Morrison continued. Your testimony will be crucial. Miss Vasquez's as well. Bull nodded slowly. He'd spent 30 years avoiding courtrooms when possible, preferring to handle problems with presence rather than paperwork. But some fights couldn't be won in dark kitchens. They had to be fought in broad daylight, with witnesses and records and the full weight of legitimate law. Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway, Carmen's hand still clasped in hers. The girl's color had returned somewhat, though she stayed close to Elena's side. Agent Morrison, Elena said. Carmen's remembered something about the camp where they held the workers. She's ready to tell you about it. Bull watched Elena's face as she spoke, the calm determination that had carried her through a week of violence and terror. She'd lost her sight but gained something else, an absolute clarity about what mattered and what didn't. Tomorrow would bring lawyers, testimony, and the slow machinery of justice. But tonight they'd stood against the darkness and won. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The sunrise painted Copper Ridge in shades of gold and amber, but Bull Mackenzie felt no warmth from it. He stood on his front porch, watching the last FBI vehicle disappear down the dirt road, leaving behind wheel ruts in the dust and the kind of silence that follows thunder. His bandaged arm throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat, a constant reminder that some victories came at a price. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Elena emerged, moving with the careful confidence she'd developed over the past week. Carmen stayed close, but the girl's grip on Elena's hand had loosened, fear gradually giving way to something like trust. They're gone, Bull said without turning around. The easy part's over, Elena replied, settling into the wooden chair beside his. Now comes the real work. Carmen perched on the porch steps, her dark eyes fixed on the mountains where the mining operation had held so many people in slavery. She'd given her statement to Agent Morrison with surprising composure, describing details that would help locate other camps, other victims. The girl had seen too much for someone her age, but she'd chosen to transform that knowledge into testimony rather than silence. Bull finally looked at Elena, seeing her properly in the morning light. The bruises on her face had darkened overnight, and exhaustion lined her features, but something fundamental had changed in her bearing. The desperate woman who'd stumbled into town a week ago had been replaced by someone who'd stared into the abyss and refused to blink. Morrison wants us in Phoenix next week for preliminary hearings, she said. Kellerman's already talking, trying to make a deal. Apparently, he's got information about operations in 6 other states. You ready for that? The courtroom circus? Elena's smile held no humor. I spent 2 years covering war crimes tribunals in Europe after the war ended. Lawyers asking difficult questions in air-conditioned rooms. That's not the hardest thing I've faced. But Bull caught the slight tremor in her voice, the way her fingers traced the arm of her chair as if anchoring herself to something solid. She was ready to fight, but she understood the cost. They all did now. Tom Davies's patrol car appeared on the horizon, raising a fresh cloud of dust as it approached. The young deputy, soon to be sheriff, if Bull read the situation correctly, had aged a decade in the past week. Discovering corruption in your own department had a way of burning away illusions about how the world worked. Any word on the workers they found at the mine? Elena asked as Tom climbed the porch steps. Tom's expression was grim. 17 still alive, but in bad shape. They're being treated at the hospital in Tucson. 3 of them are asking specifically about Carmen. Apparently, she helped distribute food and water when the guards weren't watching. Carmen looked up at the sound of her name, and Tom switched to careful Spanish. Bull didn't catch all of it, but he saw the girl's face brighten for the first time since they'd found her. Hope, apparently, was contagious. The state's sending investigators to review every missing person case from the past 2 years, Tom continued in English. They think Hutchins was involved in the cover-up from the beginning. Bull felt something cold settle in his stomach. Hutchins had been sheriff for 8 years. How many people had disappeared while the man charged with protecting them took money to look the other way? How many families had been told their missing loved ones were probably just drifters who'd moved on? There'll be more arrests, Elena said with certainty. Operations like this don't survive without local protection. Kellerman had help beyond just the sheriff. She was right, and Bull knew it. The mine foreman, certain town council members, maybe even some of the local businessmen who'd hired migrant workers and never asked too many questions when they disappeared. The investigation would tear through Copper Ridge like a flash flood, washing away comfortable assumptions about neighbors and friends. Bull thought about the crowd that had gathered when Elena first stumbled into the town square, the faces that had turned away rather than help, the silence that had greeted his thunderous demand for answers. Fear and greed had made cowards of good people, but that didn't absolve them of the choice they'd made. "I've been thinking," Bull said slowly, "about staying on as consultant to the new sheriff's department. Help Tom clean house, make sure something like this doesn't take root again." Elena turned toward him, and even without sight, her attention felt like a weight. "That's not retirement you're describing." "No," Bull admitted, "it's not. Because retirement meant accepting that evil would prosper while good men did nothing, and he'd learned too much this week to go back to that comfortable ignorance. Carmen deserved better. The 17 survivors deserved better. The 40 people who hadn't survived deserved someone to remember their names and fight for their justice." The sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night. Somewhere in Phoenix, lawyers were preparing cases that would determine whether monsters faced consequences or walked free. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, but Bull Mackenzie finally understood the destination. Justice, real justice, no matter what it cost. The call came at 4:17 a.m., jolting Bull from the first decent sleep he'd managed in 3 days. Tom Davies' voice crackled through the phone line, tight with urgency and something else. Fear. "Bull, we've got a problem. Big one." Bull sat up, his bandaged arm protesting the sudden movement. Through his bedroom window, Copper Ridge lay dark and still under a canopy of desert stars. What kind of problem? Kellerman's escaped. Federal transport was hit 20 miles outside Phoenix. 2 agents dead, 3 injured. Professional job, military precision. The words hit Bull like ice water. He was already reaching for his clothes with his good hand, the phone cradled against his shoulder. When? 2 hours ago. FBI thinks he had help from the outside, the kind of help that suggests this operation was bigger than anyone realized. Bull's mind raced through the implications. If Kellerman had escaped, it meant someone with serious resources wanted him free. More importantly, it meant everyone who'd testified against him was now a target. Where are Elena and Carmen? Safe house in Phoenix. Morrison moved them as soon as he got word. But Bull... Tom's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "There's more. We found Sheriff Hutchins dead in his cell an hour ago, made to look like suicide, but the coroner says otherwise." Bull finished dressing and holstered his service revolver, checking the cylinder out of habit. 30 years of law enforcement had taught him to read the patterns, and this one was screaming danger. Someone was cleaning house, eliminating loose ends before they could testify. "I'm coming to town," Bull said. Bull, Morrison wants you in protective custody too. These aren't local thugs anymore. We're dealing with people who can hit federal transports and make kills inside secure facilities. Bull paused at his front door, looking back at the kitchen where just days ago he'd faced down killers with nothing but stubborn courage and Elena's cast-iron skillet. That had been different. Desperate men making desperate moves. This was calculated, professional, and infinitely more dangerous. Tom, I need you to listen carefully. If they killed Hutchins, it means there are others involved, people we haven't identified yet, people who might still be in positions of authority. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Bull wondered if the connection had been severed. When Tom finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible understanding. You think there's someone else in the department? I think we've been assuming this was about local corruption when it might be about something much bigger. Bull stepped onto his porch, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The desert night felt different now, pregnant with menace instead of peace. Kellerman mentioned 6 other states. You don't build something that large without serious backing. A sound reached him then, the distant hum of vehicles approaching fast. Too fast for a casual late-night drive. Bull moved to the corner of his porch where the shadows were deepest, his hand resting on his weapon. Tom, I've got company coming. Multiple vehicles, no headlights. Bull, get out of there now. I'm 10 minutes away with backup. Won't make it in time. Bull could see them now, 3 dark SUVs moving in formation down the dirt road toward his house. Professional, military, exactly what Tom had described. Listen to me, son. If something happens to me, you make damn sure Elena's testimony gets heard. Carmen's too. They're the only witnesses left who can connect all the pieces. Bull. He hung up and tossed the phone aside, moving quickly toward the back of his house. The vehicles were close enough now that he could hear the crunch of tires on gravel. 6 days ago, he'd been a retired sheriff looking forward to quiet mornings and simple problems. Now he was the last thing standing between organized killers and the witnesses who could bring them down. The first SUV stopped 50 yards from his front door. The other 2 spread wide, flanking his property with tactical precision. Bull counted at least 8 figures emerging from the vehicles. Too many to fight directly, but his house sat on 5 acres of broken terrain that he knew better than any stranger ever would. Through his back window, he could see muzzle flashes beginning to strobe in the darkness as automatic weapons chewed apart his front door. They weren't here for arrest or interrogation. This was pure elimination, designed to silence him permanently, before he could testify about what he'd learned. Bull slipped out his back door and into the desert darkness, carrying nothing but his revolver and 30 years of experience hunting dangerous men through unforgiving country. Behind him, his house was dying in a hail of gunfire. Ahead lay the hardest test of his life, staying alive long enough to ensure that justice survived even if he didn't. The final test had begun. The desert floor was treacherous in darkness, studded with cholla and hidden arroyos that could break an ankle or worse. Bull moved through it like a ghost, his boots finding purchase on stone and hard-packed earth, while automatic weapons fire continued to tear apart his home behind him. 30 years of tracking fugitives through this same terrain had burned every rock formation and hiding spot into his memory. He counted at least 8 muzzle flashes, maybe more. Professional shooters with military-grade weapons, moving with the kind of coordination that spoke of serious training and serious money. This wasn't local muscle or desperate mine foreman. This was the real power behind the operation, finally showing its face. The gunfire stopped abruptly, replaced by harsh voices calling orders in the darkness. Bull crouched behind a boulder formation he'd used as a landmark since childhood, controlling his breathing and listening to the tactical chatter. They were sweeping the house, confirming his absence, regrouping for pursuit. A spotlight blazed to life, its harsh white beam sweeping across the desert in methodical arcs. Then another, and a third. They had night vision equipment too. Bull could see the faint infrared signatures dancing along the ridgeline where their overwatch positions had taken root. His radio crackled softly against his belt. Tom's voice, urgent but controlled. Bull, If you can hear this, we're 5 minutes out. FBI chopper inbound from Phoenix. Just stay alive. 5 minutes might as well have been 5 hours. The spotlight beams were closing in, and Bull could hear boots on stone as the sweep team began their methodical advance. He had two advantages: knowledge of terrain and the kind of desperate fury that came from watching evil try to win through superior firepower. The first shooter appeared 30 yards to his left, moving with practiced stealth but unfamiliar with the ground. Bull waited until the man passed his position, then rose like a shadow and struck with the butt of his revolver. The impact dropped the shooter silently, but Bull knew the absence would be noticed within minutes. He took the fallen man's rifle and tactical radio, listening to the coordinated chatter as the team adjusted their search pattern. Professional voices, calm and methodical. They'd done this before, in other places, against other witnesses who'd gotten too close to the truth. Target acquisition negative, Sector 7 clear, came through the radio, advancing to secondary positions. Bull moved deeper into the boulder field, using every shadow and depression to mask his movement. The spotlight beams swept overhead like mechanical vultures, probing for any sign of movement. Behind him, his house continued to burn, 30 years of memories reduced to orange light against the star-filled sky. A figure emerged from behind a rock formation directly ahead, rifle raised and scanning. Bull had maybe 3 seconds before the man's night vision picked up his heat signature. He took the shot without hesitation, the crack of his revolver splitting the night air like thunder. The figure dropped, but the gunshot had given away Bull's position. Immediately, all 3 spotlights converged on his location while automatic weapons fire began chewing apart the rocks around him. Granite chips stung his face as he pressed himself flat against the stone, feeling the concussion of high-velocity rounds passing inches from his head. Contact Sector 9. Target is armed and mobile. Bull rolled left as a grenade exploded where he'd been lying, the concussion lifting him bodily and slamming him against a boulder. His ears rang and his vision blurred, but he forced himself to keep moving. Staying still meant death. The radio chatter had changed tone now, urgency replacing calm professionalism. They'd expected to find a retired sheriff, not someone capable of fighting back effectively. Bull had disrupted their timeline, and that gave him hope. Another shooter appeared on the ridgeline above, silhouetted against the stars. Bull's revolver barked twice, and the figure tumbled down the rocky slope in a clatter of equipment and curses. 4 rounds left in the cylinder, and no time to reload safely. The distant thrum of rotor blades reached his ears, Tom's backup arriving faster than expected. Immediately, the tactical chatter shifted again, voices calling for extraction and abort codes. They'd come to eliminate a witness quietly, but a firefight with federal authorities would generate exactly the kind of attention they couldn't afford. A final spotlight beam swept across Bull's position, lingering for a moment before clicking off. Engines roared to life in the distance, and the remaining shooters began their retreat, moving with the same professional precision they'd used to arrive. Bull lay pressed against the stone, breathing hard and listening to the sounds of departure. His house was a total loss, but he was alive. More importantly, Elena and Carmen were still alive, still able to testify about what they'd seen. The helicopter spotlight found him as Tom's patrol cars crested the ridge, their red and blue lights painting the desert in patriotic colors. Bull raised his good hand and waved, then slowly stood to face whatever came next. The confrontation was over. The war for justice had just begun. The helicopter settled onto the desert floor in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash, its spotlight cutting through the smoke that still rose from Bull's burning home. Agent Morrison emerged before the blades stopped spinning, his face grim as he surveyed the tactical destruction scattered across the landscape. "How many?" Morrison shouted over the dying engine noise. "At least 8, Bull called back, walking slowly toward the gathering of federal agents and local deputies. His shirt was torn and bloodied from granite shards, his left arm hanging useless at his side. Professional military. They weren't here for conversation. Morrison nodded grimly. Same people who hit the transport. We found the vehicles they used, stolen from a National Guard depot in Nevada 3 days ago. This is organized crime at the federal level, Bull. We're not dealing with local corruption anymore. Tom Davies approached, his young face etched with worry and something approaching awe. Bull, your house, I'm sorry. I know what that place meant to you. Bull looked back at the orange glow consuming 30 years of memories. His grandfather's rocking chair, the kitchen table where he'd shared countless meals with Martha before cancer took her, the bedroom where she'd died holding his hand and making him promise to keep fighting the good fight. All of it burning now, because he'd chosen to stand up when decent people should stand up. Just wood and stone, Bull said quietly, though they all heard the lie in his voice. People matter more than property. Morrison was studying a tactical radio he'd taken from one of the fallen attackers. They were coordinating with someone, higher authority giving real-time updates. Bull, I need you to understand what we're facing here. This operation spans 6 states and involves connections to military contractors, private security firms, maybe even foreign interests. The mine was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. What are you saying? I'm saying your testimony just became the most dangerous thing in America. Kellerman talked before he escaped, named names we never expected. Federal judges, Department of Defense officials, people with the power to make witnesses disappear permanently. Bull felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd spent his career believing that justice was a simple matter. Catch the bad guys, put them in jail, protect the innocent. But this was different. This was about challenging a system that had grown so corrupt it could reach into federal facilities and eliminate threats with military precision. Elena and Carmen? Safe for now, but that won't last long. These people have resources we're still discovering. They can't afford to let any witnesses reach trial, which means they'll keep coming, Bull finished, until everyone who can testify is dead. The agents were photographing the scene now, collecting shell casings and documenting the tactical positions the attackers had used. Professional work by professional killers, the kind of people who could make problems disappear without leaving inconvenient questions behind. Tom Davies pulled Bull aside, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Bull, Morrison's offered you witness protection, new identity, relocation, federal security until after the trials. But, it would mean disappearing completely. New name, new life, no contact with anyone from your old world, ever. Tom's eyes were bright with unshed tears. You'd have to give up being Bull Mackenzie. Give up Copper Ridge. Give up everything that makes you who you are. Bull understood now. This was the price Morrison had been reluctant to name. Total sacrifice of identity and history in service of justice. He would survive, but everything that defined him would die. The retired sheriff who'd spent decades protecting this community would cease to exist, replaced by a manufactured identity in some distant city where nobody knew his name or cared about his convictions. What about Elena and Carmen? Same deal. They disappear too, but separately. You'd never see them again. Contact between protected witnesses compromises security for everyone. Bull looked around the desert battlefield where his old life had just died in fire and gunshots. Morrison approached, holding an encrypted phone and wearing the expression of a man delivering terminal diagnoses. Bull, we've got 40 minutes to get you out of here. Private jet waiting at the airfield, new documents already being prepared. You'll be Samuel Morrison by tomorrow morning, retired insurance adjuster living in Portland, Oregon. Complete backstory, financial records, the works. And if I refuse? Morrison's silence was answer enough. Bull Mackenzie looked one last time at the burning ruins of his house, at the desert landscape where he'd spent 70 years becoming the man he was. Then he looked at Tom Davies, seeing in the young deputy's face the future of everything he'd fought to protect. Take care of this place, Bull said quietly. Make sure it remembers what happened here. Then Samuel Bull Mackenzie walked toward the helicopter that would carry him into exile, leaving behind his name, his home, and everything he'd ever been in service of a justice that demanded the ultimate sacrifice. The cost of victory, he realized, was the death of the man who'd won it. The helicopter lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying Bull away from everything he'd ever known. Below, the burning remains of his house grew smaller until they disappeared entirely, just another orange dot in the vast Arizona desert. He pressed his face against the window, watching Copper Ridge's scattered lights fade into memory. Across from him, Agent Morrison worked steadily on a tablet, finalizing the details of Samuel Morrison's new existence. Birth certificate from a Portland hospital that had burned down decades ago, making verification impossible. Employment records at an insurance company that existed only on paper. A complete life story for a man who had never lived. "Your backstory is simple," Morrison said without looking up. "Widower, no children, recently retired. Quiet man who keeps to himself, the kind of neighbor people wave to but never really know." He finally met Bull's eyes. That last part's crucial. The moment you start acting like the man you used to be, you're dead. Bull nodded, understanding the weight of what that meant. No more stepping in when someone needed help. No more being the person others turned to in crisis. 70 years of instincts and moral conviction would have to be buried as completely as Bull Mackenzie's identity. The helicopter banked west toward the airfield, and Bull caught a glimpse of the mine in the distance. Dark and abandoned now, its secrets finally exposed. How many workers had disappeared into those tunnels? How many families had grieved without ever learning what happened to their loved ones? At least now there would be answers. At least Elena's investigation would mean something. "What happens to the town?" Bull asked. "Clean sweep. Every official connected to the operation is being arrested as we speak. Tom Davies will be interim sheriff until proper elections can be held." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "He's a good man, Bull. You trained him well." That brought small comfort. Tom was capable, but he was young. The weight of protecting an entire community would fall heavily on shoulders that had carried nothing heavier than routine patrol duties. Still, someone had to carry forward the work Bull could no longer do. The private jet sat waiting on the tarmac, engines already warming. A handful of federal agents secured the perimeter while medical personnel waited to treat Bull's injuries properly. Everything moved with military precision, another life being erased and rebuilt in service of a justice that demanded anonymity. As they transferred from helicopter to plane, Bull's radio crackled one final time. Tom's voice, breaking slightly, "Bull, if you can hear this. Elena wanted you to know something. She said to tell you that sometimes the greatest victory is the one nobody remembers, that the best lawmen are the ones who disappear into the work itself." Bull closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words. Elena understood what this cost, because she'd already sacrificed everything once before. Her sight, her career, her old life, in service of truth. Now all three of them, Bull, Elena, and Carmen, would disappear into new identities, their real names known only to federal files and each other's memories. The jet lifted off as dawn broke over the desert, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Bull watched Arizona fall away beneath him, carrying with it every relationship he'd ever built, every reputation he'd earned, every connection that had defined his 70 years of existence. He thought about Martha's grave, which he would never visit again. About the diner where he'd eaten breakfast every Tuesday for 15 years. About the hardware store owner who always asked his advice on difficult customers. About children who would grow up never knowing that the gentle giant who'd once kept their community safe had been forced to die in order to save it. But he also thought about Elena's courage in the face of blindness and terror. About Carmen's strength in testifying despite her fear. About Tom's determination to carry forward work that might cost him everything. About the migrant workers' families who would finally learn what happened to their loved ones. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, heading toward a city where Samuel Morrison would live quietly in a small apartment, shopping for groceries and watching television, and never again being someone that mattered to anyone. It was, Bull realized, the loneliest kind of victory, the triumph that could never be celebrated or even acknowledged. Morrison handed him a manila envelope containing his new life, driver's license, social security card, bank statements, apartment lease, medical records. Everything needed to become someone else entirely. Bull held the envelope without opening it, understanding that the moment he did, Bull Mackenzie would be truly dead. "Any regrets?" Morrison asked quietly. Bull looked out the window at the country passing beneath them, a nation where corruption could grow so deep that good people had to disappear to protect the truth, where justice sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice, not death, but the complete erasure of the person who'd fought for it. "None," he said finally, and meant it. The man who would become Samuel Morrison settled back in his seat and began the long work of learning to be someone he'd never been, carrying forward a victory that would remain forever anonymous. The return. 3 years later, Samuel Morrison stood in the produce section of a Portland grocery store, examining apples with the careful attention of a man who had nothing but time. His cart contained the modest necessities of a solitary life: frozen dinners for one, instant coffee, a newspaper he would read cover to cover before discarding without discussion. The woman selecting oranges beside him struggled with her bags, one tumbling to scatter fruit across the polished floor. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward her, then stopped, trembling with the force of suppressed instinct. Bull Mackenzie would have helped immediately, gathering the oranges with gentle efficiency and perhaps offering to carry her groceries to her car. Samuel Morrison simply stepped aside and continued shopping. But something had changed in that moment of hesitation. The careful walls he'd built around his old identity had cracked just enough to let light through. That evening, Samuel sat in his efficiency apartment watching the news when the anchor's voice made him freeze. In other developments, the federal trials stemming from the Copper Ridge human trafficking conspiracy concluded today with the conviction of 12 defendants, including former federal officials. The investigation, which began 3 years ago when local authorities uncovered a mining operation being used to transport victims across state lines, has been called one of the most significant victories against organized crime in recent memory. The camera showed brief footage of Copper Ridge's main street, largely unchanged but somehow cleaner, more hopeful. Samuel leaned forward, searching the frames for familiar faces, finding none but feeling a profound stirring in his chest, the first real emotion he'd allowed himself in 36 months. The next morning brought something that hadn't happened since his exile. Samuel Morrison made a decision that mattered. He drove to the Portland Public Library and, for the first time since his transformation, began researching not insurance regulations or crossword puzzles, but missing persons cases in Oregon, local disappearances that shared certain patterns, migrant workers whose families had stopped hearing from them, the kind of details that looked routine to most people but rang warning bells in the mind of someone who'd spent a lifetime recognizing the shape of evil. He found 17 cases across 3 counties, 17 families who deserved answers. That afternoon, Samuel Morrison walked into the Portland Police Department and asked to speak with someone about cold cases. The desk sergeant looked up at the towering white-haired man with curious respect. There was something in Samuel's bearing that suggested authority, though his identification showed nothing more impressive than an insurance background. "I may have information relevant to some missing persons cases," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the careful control of someone choosing each word deliberately. Detective Maria Santos emerged 20 minutes later to find Samuel still standing exactly where the desk sergeant had left him, patient as stone. She was younger than Tom Davies had been, with sharp eyes that reminded Samuel painfully of Elena's intensity before blindness had claimed her sight. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you have information about missing persons." Samuel nodded toward the files she carried. 17 cases, all migrant workers. All disappeared between specific dates that correspond with certain agricultural contracts. He paused, then added something that surprised him with its honesty. "I used to be in law enforcement. I recognize patterns." Detective Santos studied him more carefully. "Used to be? Where? Somewhere that doesn't exist anymore." Samuel replied, which was true enough. They spent 3 hours reviewing the cases, Samuel's trained eye identifying connections the overworked detective had missed. Labor contractors with suspicious scheduling, transportation companies with federal violations, the same web of corruption rebuilt in new territory with fresh victims. As they worked, Samuel felt something awakening inside him, not Bull Mackenzie, who was truly dead, but something new, a man who could carry forward the work without needing recognition or gratitude. Someone who understood that justice didn't require a badge or even a real name. When Detective Santos walked him to the exit, she said, "Mr. Morrison, I don't know what your background really is, and I'm not asking, but if you'd consider consulting on these cases, unofficially, I think we could help a lot of families find answers." Samuel looked through the station's glass doors at the city beyond, seeing for the first time not exile but possibility. "I'll be in touch," he said. That night, Samuel Morrison sat at his small table and wrote the first letter he'd composed since his transformation. Not to anyone he'd known as Bull Mackenzie, that would always be impossible, but to Detective Santos, outlining an investigation strategy that would take months to complete and might save dozens of lives. He signed it simply Samuel Morrison, Consultant, and realized with something approaching peace that he had found his way home. Not to Copper Ridge or Bull Mackenzie's identity, but to the work itself, the endless, anonymous, necessary work of standing between the innocent and those who would harm them. The man Samuel Morrison had become sealed the envelope and began planning for tomorrow's investigation, carrying forward a victory that would remain forever unnamed but never unfinished. #Chapter 18, The New Beginning. 6 months after that first meeting with Detective Santos, Samuel Morrison had become someone he never expected, a ghost who solved crimes. Working from his small apartment and a corner table at the downtown library, he'd helped Portland police close 14 missing persons cases and identify a trafficking network that stretched from Oregon to California. His reports arrived by email from an encrypted account. His insights reached investigators through Detective Santos, who had learned not to ask too many questions about her most valuable consultant. The work sustained him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Each family reunited with answers, each predator identified and arrested, each pattern recognized before it could claim more victims. These victories built something new inside the hollow space where Bull Mackenzie used to live. Not the same man, but perhaps something better, someone who could help without needing credit, who could serve justice without requiring recognition. On a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in November, Samuel stood in Pioneer Courthouse Square feeding pigeons when his encrypted phone buzzed with an unusual message. Detective Santos wanted to meet in person, something they'd avoided for months to maintain the fiction of his anonymity. He found her at a coffee shop near the police station, tension radiating from her small frame as she studied the door. When Samuel approached, she gestured to the chair across from her with the urgency of someone carrying dangerous news. "Samuel," she began, then stopped herself. "That is your real name, isn't it?" He considered the question carefully. Samuel Morrison felt more real now than the man who died in the Arizona desert 3.5 years ago. "It is now," he said. "Good, because I have something that belongs to Samuel Morrison specifically." She slid a thick manila envelope across the table. "This arrived through federal channels yesterday, addressed to Samuel Morrison, Consultant, Portland Police Department. No one knew to route it to you except—" Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he recognized the handwriting. Neat, careful script that moved across the envelope in perfectly straight lines, the writing of someone who'd learned to compose by touch alone. Inside, Elena's letter was brief, but devastating in its impact. "Samuel, I don't know what name you live under now, but I know you're still fighting the same fight. Carmen and I are safe, but we've never forgotten what you sacrificed for us. I wanted you to know that the work continues. I'm writing again. Freelance investigations that certain newspapers publish without asking too many questions about their blind correspondent. Last month's piece helped expose labor trafficking in Texas. Carmen graduated from law school and works with immigrant families. We carry forward what you started. But this letter isn't about our work. It's about something Detective Santos probably didn't mention. There's a young deputy in Copper Ridge who's been asking federal authorities about a consultant named Samuel Morrison. Tom Davies heard about your work through law enforcement channels and wondered if it might be someone he used to know. He's not asking for contact or confirmation, he's asking for help. Copper Ridge has new problems, different corruption, same vulnerable people. Tom could use guidance from someone who understands how evil rebuilds itself. Detective Santos has agreed to facilitate communication if you're willing. You chose to disappear to protect the truth. Now the truth needs you to stay disappeared, but not silent. Your friend always, Elena. Samuel read the letter twice before looking up to find Detective Santos watching him with careful sympathy. The federal agent who delivered this said there are no strings attached, no requirements, no obligations, just an offer to connect you with someone who could use what you know. Through the coffee shop's rain-streaked windows, Samuel watched Portland's citizens hurrying through their Tuesday morning routines, office workers checking phones, students clutching textbooks, parents shepherding children toward schools, normal people living normal lives because someone stood between them and the darkness they never saw coming. Tom Davies, Samuel said quietly, testing the name aloud for the first time in years, his former deputy, now sheriff, facing the same impossible choices that had once destroyed Bull Mackenzie's life. But this time, Tom wouldn't have to face them alone. I can set up secure communication, Detective Santos offered. Anonymous consultation. You help him read the patterns, identify the threats, develop strategies. All the expertise, none of the exposure. Samuel folded Elena's letter carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease, and patches of blue sky appeared between the clouds, the first sunshine he'd noticed in weeks. Yes, he said simply. That evening, Samuel Morrison composed his first message to Sheriff Tom Davies, beginning a correspondence that would span years and save lives across multiple states. He signed it SM, Consultant, and realized that he had finally found his true identity, not the man he'd been or the man he'd become, but the work itself. The man who had once been Bull Mackenzie sealed the message and began planning for tomorrow's investigations, carrying forward a victory that would remain forever nameless but never unfinished. In the end, justice didn't require a name, only the willingness to stand again and again between the innocent and those who would harm them.